Hello, everybody.
Hello.
It's so good to see you all. Good afternoon. My name is Alia Berman, and I am here today with Tarana Burke, and I am so excited to have this discussion with her today. Tarana Burke is a civil rights activist who was the original founder of the MeToo movement, which she started in 2006. It later became a global phenomenon that raised awareness about sexual harassment, abuse, and assault in society in 2017. Tarana emphasizes that Me Too is more than just a moment in time. And in fact, she's been organizing around systemic issues disproportionately impacting marginalized people, particularly Black women and girls, for more than 3 decades. Tarana, it's an honor to be here to talk with you today.
Thank you.
So, one measure of the power of a platform is longevity, especially in this era of rampant change. So, it's noteworthy that the Me Too movement celebrated its 5-year anniversary this past October.
The hashtag.
Hashtag,
Yeah.
yes, the hashtag this past October. So, the discussion is timely. And this conversation is also important to me, both personally and professionally, because I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer for TBWA, which is a brand experience company that helps businesses build brand platforms that connect with consumers and communities through authentic storytelling. We believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are core to this, and that the Me Too movement is one of the best examples of a power of a platform to drive equity and change. So, for those of you listening today, whether you are an innovator, a business leader, or a creative, there's some really powerful lessons that the Me Too movement provides in terms of how progress happens, how to define modern culture, and even how the platform influences not just culture, but also the business environment. All right, so let's dig in, Tarana. And the first thing I want to talk about is the specifics of the role of a platform. So, in communications and activism, a platform supports every part of a movement or business, and every experience ties back to that platform. So, for example, one of our clients is McDonald's, and their platform is around moments of joy. So, everything from the way a commercial makes you feel, to the logo design, to the experience you have while navigating the app, even the way you feel when you're sitting in a McDonald's restaurant with your kids eating fries, they all tie back to that experience. Given that, why did you choose the words "Me Too"? Like, what was the role of the words in connecting all parts of the movement?
Um, the words "Me Too" were really simple words. I was looking for something. Well, first of all, I had the words empowerment or empathy before "Me Too." But I remember really clearly when I sent an email to my girlfriend at the time saying that I found these words. I write about it in my book when I discovered when the words actually came to me, which is a whole really dramatic sort of. When I had an interview with Oprah, she called it I had a dark night of the soul.
Yes.
But it was a sort of a really dramatic experience I had, and I literally woke up and wrote those words in a notebook. But I had been doing these workshops using the idea of empowerment through empathy first, because it was it was really this deep empathy that I was shown that was helping me to heal personally. But I knew that I was working with young people, with these young girls, and you can't anybody who's worked with young people or even with survivors or people period, you can't sort of censor yourself all of the time. And so those words were a way to both tell my story or tell the story, without taking up a lot of space. I would say this, it's either the whole story or the start of a story, right? In just two simple words. And even the way I write it, which is the way that's not on the screen anymore, but even the way that I write it, I always use lowercase letters. It's sort of to speak softly, right? To indicate that it is something that is powerful but still gentle. A conversation, like people don't know this logo, But in this logo, the color change, initially it was pink and black when I first started using it, and then Beyonce came out with the pink and black, and I had to change it. but but it's always sort of looked similar to this. And I had a period at the end because it can be the full story. And I wanted to put the logo up here today to talk about it because my original goal when we first started this and I first made a logo was that I wanted this logo to be universal. I wanted survivors to see this anywhere they were in the world and feel something. I wanted people to know that this meant. I remember when we first had T-shirts, they were donated to us. And our first sort of tagline was, "You're not alone, it's a movement." So the T-shirt said, "Me too." And on the back it said, "You're not alone, it's a movement." And you talk about branding. People would see the shirts, and men would, like, we would wear them, the people in our little group, whatever. And men would be like, "Oh, me too." "Yeah, me too." And then they'd see the back and they'd be like, "Oh." And we're like, "That's right."
It's one way to get their attention.
Yeah, but then, and we had a 1-800 number back in the day. We've come a long way. But there's a lot to be said about branding and storytelling and just having something simple and powerful to say, right? This is a subject matter that sometimes doesn't require a lot of talking. And the people, survivors, don't want to do a lot of talking. And it wasn't about really the world. It was about us talking to each other, right? It was about survivor to survivor. Like, when you walk into a room, and I would do my workshops, there was never, if it were 50 people in the room, at least 25 of them could say "me too." And that's all they could say. And so that's why the words were so powerful to me.
Yeah, I think it's particularly powerful when you talk about it in terms of using the words, like specifically "me too," as a way to incite like a conversation between two people.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you're doing alone or by yourself. And I think the very nature of the words help to unite people. They're uniting survivors. So I think it's an important thing. And to your point about ensuring that the words and how they, in how making sure that the experiences and the stories that you're telling connect to the platform, I think you're so right in the terms of simplicity and being able to create dialogue around something that is simple but also incredibly powerful and compelling.
Yeah, you have to remember, I was dealing with children. When I initially started, these were junior high school girls. So it had to be very simple and very straightforward. And then when I put it on MySpace initially, that's the story many people have heard. When I put it on MySpace initially, it was the furthest thing from my mind that grown women would reach out and it would connect to them. And when it did, it immediately, I was like, "Oh, of course, I'm a survivor. Of course other women want this and need this." And they would come into send messages, to the inbox then, and say, "Me too, me too." And we would get these messages, and it was like a light bulb went off. Like, of course women need this. If my junior high school girls need this, they're gonna grow up one day and still carry these wounds.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned empathy a little while ago, and the MeToo movement is rooted in the philosophy of empowerment through empathy. Why is empathy so effective?
I think that people don't use or think about empathy. We think about sympathy more often than we think about empathy, or we use sympathy. But empathy is really the way that we connect with each other, the ways that we understand each other, right? You don't have to have had the experience, the exact experience that another person had in order to empathize with them. And I did a thing the other day, and I said something that people were like, "Oh," and the light bulb went off. And I'm gonna say it again. Because one of the deep disconnects that I find, and this has been made really apparent to me in the last 5 years, is this lack of empathy and this lack of empathy that's caused by, I think, patriarchy and sexism and how deeply rooted it is in this country. And I'm gonna be gendered for a second, but actually I think it's actually bigger than the gender spectrum, because I think women, people who identify as women, and people who are along the gender spectrum have a easier time empathizing with each other. And I think men struggle with this, and this is not an indictment of men, but this is because of how society socializes
Right.
men. right? When we allow ourselves to empathize with people, right? You don't have to have been experienced sexual violence. We know what trauma does, right? We know what pain feels like. We know that we don't want other people to experience the kinds of pain that we had. You know, that's why Me Too is resonates with some people. Whether it was something that happened to you as a child or something that happened to you in college, I don't have to have had the exact same experience to know what it left inside of my body.
Yep.
And to know that when I see another person, I want to do everything possible to make sure that they don't carry that same pain. The other day I was having this public conversation and I said, part of the problem that I see is that when a woman stands up, and this is the part that was gendered, but that when a woman stands up and tells her story, oftentimes there are folks, because it's not just men, there are folks who only can hear a man's life being ruined, right? They hear the words coming out of her mouth and they hear the story and they can only hear a man's life being ruined. And there are others who can hear a woman's life being saved. And that's what empathy does.
Right.
When a woman stands up, when a person stands up to tell their story, they are not thinking about ruining somebody's life. They are thinking about saving their own first. That's what empathy does. When you can hear first that a person is trying to save their own life, getting that story up and out of your body is a matter of saving your own life. Those of us who are trying to survive, that's what survival is. It's not just a word we throw around. We are literally trying to survive. And part of that survival is saving our life. What do you think we're trying to survive? And that's why the word is survival, because we're trying to save our lives.
Yeah, and I think too, to your point, that empathy really drives people to understand things from a very different perspective, you know, than the ones that society has told us all along. I also think about how important empathy is with respect to Black women and girls, which is where you started work, especially because this is a population of people whose stories and narratives are often overlooked or not included in the conversation when it comes to whether it's gender equity, you know,
Exactly.
or other things that are trying to advance opportunities or provide access to certain communities.
And so add on to that, if sexism and patriarchy don't allow you to hear a woman saving her own life, what do racism add on to that?
Yeah.
What does racism add on to that? When a Black woman stands up to tell her story, what lens are you listening to that story through, right? You just keep adding the isms onto that. When a queer person stands up to tell their story, what lens are you listening to that story? You don't hear us trying to save our lives. You hear every stereotype,
Yes.
every ism, every other thing that you have been socialized, that you have, you understand what I'm saying? So that's why the stories that are being told, the stories that you all are telling are important. That's why the job that you do is important. The job that I'm doing is important. And the stories that are being told are important.
Yeah, so what you're saying is storytelling is at the heart
Absolutely.
of empathy. And, you know, it's a fundamental need for human beings because in order for us to connect to each other, we need to be able to see, you know, those stories and connect to each other through our individual stories. I think, you know, one of the reasons why Me Too has been so effective is because it's been narrated by the women and the survivors themselves. And I think that's an important lesson for brands in terms of how you connect to communities, you know, by making sure that the people who belong to those communities have the opportunity to direct the story, you know, to influence how that story is made. One of the examples I think about as you're talking, you know, in particular with Black women and girls, is a campaign that we did with Gatorade to celebrate the retirement of Serena Williams, and Beyonce narrated the commercial. And it was really about looking through the lens specifically of, you know, Serena as a Black woman and what it means in society to have empowerment through owning your identity and loving your body in a society that, you know, traditionally hasn't looked at Black bodies as a sign of conventional beauty. And so I think, again, you know, making sure that those communities are leading the narratives is an incredible part of making sure that, you know, that there's empathy for them.
Absolutely. I mean, my work, I have MeToo as an organization. I also have a production company because it became important to me to not just tell story, not just to do the work in community, but to have another vehicle to be able to tell stories, because somebody has to tell legitimate stories out in this world. We have to do it through advertising. We have to do it in Hollywood. We have to have people who have been on the ground in the world, having these lived experiences at the helm telling these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just hearing you talking about advertising and creative industries in general, I think making sure that, you have those communities that are able to serve as the authors, the producers, the casting directors, of those stories, critically important in making progress. Yeah. So storytelling and empathy reinforce community. And, in TBWA's experience, the magic happens when campaigns tie audiences together through an effective platform and a community-centric approach. So can you talk a little bit about what the most important things that you have learned about building community through your work?
Well, first of all, I believe 100% healing is at the center of my work, and healing does not happen in a silo. Nothing happens in a silo, right? People see me at the forefront of this, but I don't do this work alone, and nothing that I've ever done has happened without community. And I think we have to remember that always. Anybody that you see elevated to any position has a community behind them, no matter what they say. Number one. And I don't think that good, quality, effective work happens without community. And I also think that we have to be very careful. When you see people elevated to positions of power, you need to make sure that they have community, that they name community, right? Because we also need to make sure people are accountable to somebody.
Yep.
We are often fast to elevate folks or to listen to people and to their wisdom, and then who are they accountable to? And then we want to figure out how to hold them accountable when they disappoint us, and we look behind the curtain and there's nobody there because they don't have community. And so I think that that is a very important element to add to our checklist when we're looking at this next, people rise to blue check fame very easily nowadays, right? And we don't look and make sure that they have community. I don't do anything without my personal community. And I think that goes across the board, whether you're in an organization, a company. I also think that community is expansive, right? So if it's TBWA, you should be creating community even with other companies. That doesn't mean you have to do cross projects with each other. I mean, I know there's some complications with some of that in the corporate world, but you all should be in places like this. You should be in conversation with each other. You should be figuring out what you all are doing, best practices, all of that kind of stuff is really important, right? I guess that's why you have these kind of conferences, but those things are really important. And I think, I know we're going to get to another part about what companies can do, but I think it is really important to know how other companies are moving, what's happening internally, and the employees need to know how things are moving internally. Yeah, we have to do more things in community. Folks are so siloed and keep everything, to themselves.
Yeah, I also think a really important role about community is that the reason it's so important is because it creates a sense of belonging. Like we talk about all the time in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which is, people want to feel as though they belong to something. Mm-hmm. And I think community also makes you feel as though you're a part of something that's greater than yourself.
Absolutely.
It provides a sense of safety and security. Mm-hmm. I think all of those things have always been important, but I think especially in today's day and age with the number of social issues that we're addressing,
we won't get anywhere moving through these issues. I think what's happening, what I've seen now, and I have been in movement work most of my life since I was a teenager. I would say the last probably 10 years, I have seen more cross-movement work than I've seen my whole life. I've seen more people, the folks who are doing racial justice are walking with the folks who are doing, immigrant work, the folks who are doing climate change, the folks who are doing, we're finally seeing in a more crisp and clear way that we are fighting against the same oppressors, the same people who are trying to keep you down or trying to keep me down. And
it's all interconnected.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. And, not for nothing, sexual violence has been so bastardized in the social justice movement for such a long time, and still, even with the and we'll get to this. I probably should save this for the challenges question, but that's been one of the challenges, and I'll talk more about that,
Yeah.
in a minute.
Yeah. So speaking of challenges, let's just move right on there. So outrage and cancel culture has surrounded much of the MeToo movement, as we know. But there's also been, I think, a lot of hope and unity, of course, in that. So, does positivity and optimism drive more impact? Why? And what role does outrage play in all of this?
I'm not afraid of outrage, right? I think that there's a such thing as righteous rage. I think that we have to be able to tap into righteous rage and use it when it's necessary as a driver, right? We can't be completely motivated by rage, obviously. That's not a healthy thing. But I also think that there's a way that people have used this term toxic positivity.
Yeah.
I think there's a way that we go overboard with trying to kumbaya everything. That's not realistic.
And that needs to be truth. Yeah.
It's just not realistic. When I get up every day and I'm scared to turn on social media to see who else has been murdered from my community by law enforcement, when I don't know who's going to be, I just don't know what other horrific thing is going to happen to people who look like me, or people, there is a rage that comes. We lived under that ridiculous regime for the last, for 4 years. I should be outraged that a person like Donald Trump could be elected to office. I should be outraged by that. We all should be outraged by that. And I should be able to say that out loud and be goddamn mad about it. And put that on somewhere. Put that on the Instagrams and the TikToks. Put that on, I should be outraged by that.
Yeah.
And that's a righteous rage. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, should I be up every day grumbling and no, that's not good for your heart, right? But I think what happens is that people start saying, my next book is called Revolutionary Grace, and y'all like that title? Oh, good.
That's a great title. It's a great title.
And the reason why, and one of the things I'm talking about is this idea that we don't have of who gets grace. Now, I'll give you an example. 2 examples real quick. When in 2020, and even in 2016, when folks were rioting, or there's other words we like to use, but when people were in the streets and expressing a lot of rage, do you think in 2016 or 2015 was it, when I watching Mike Brown's body lay in that street for 4 hours? Do you think that not make my blood boil? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you not think that there was me wanting to meet? And I just didn't do it because I was old.
Yeah.
I was too old to be running through the streets, but I wanted to, right?
The anger is legitimate.
The anger is legitimate. But I'll give you another example. I remember in Charleston, the mass murder in Charleston in a church. Y'all remember this, right? So it's 2015. It was June 17th, 2015. And I remember it because it was the day my child graduated from high school. There was a big debate inside of the Black community. And I'm not telling Black folks business, but because this was on the internet. But it was a big debate inside of the Black community because some of the family members decided to forgive the murderer immediately. They called for peace. And one of the husband of one of the women who was murdered came out and called for peace and said he forgave, what was his name, McVeigh? I forgot, that's not McVeigh, that's somebody else. I got a bad mind, y'all got to work with me sometime. But I forgot his name, but he forgave him immediately. And that's fine. I'm a Christian, I get it, we're called to forgive, and that's fine. But one of the things that bothered me that he said was that we had to have grace for him. And that he wanted to, and he said in an interview that he wanted to hurry up. He said this some years later. He wanted to hurry up and call for peace. Because those Black Lives Matter folks, they was ready to come out there and riot and run through the street. And we didn't need all of that in Charleston. And I said, how is it that you have the ability to look this white man in the face who murdered your wife and find grace for him, but you couldn't look at the rage and anger. And really, it was the sadness that we didn't know where to put, but into our rage, into the faces of these black people in the street, and you couldn't find no grace for them.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm okay with grace, but we need a revolutionary grace. We need a different kind of grace that says it's okay to have rage. It's okay to be angry.
And it's necessary.
And it's
that's
necessary
what provokes
sometime.
action.
It has to drive us sometime. It's okay. The survivors who stood up when MeToo went viral and said, I've been holding this in the pit of my stomach for 40 years and I need to say this out loud. This happened to me too. I'm angry. I have a lot of empathy for them. They weren't trying to ruin anybody's life. They were trying to save their own. Now, what I want for them is healing. What I want for them is to go to their grave with some peace. And what they want for themselves is that as well. Was there accountability that came from that? Were there consequences that came from that? Maybe. But that wasn't their goal for many of the people who came forward.
Yep.
That got twisted and turned into something else. Is that the fault of the people who are trying to save their lives? Should they not try to save their own lives when an opportunity came for them to let this thing out of their body? Should they die with that toxicity inside of them when an opportunity finally came? They were willing to do that, right?
Yeah,
But they didn't.
And I think that that's why, just sort of connecting back to what you're talking about in terms of empathy and telling those stories is so critical. I think that's why it's so important. And you're absolutely right that there is a place for outrage. It's necessary, it's valid, it helps spur people to action. Where do you think optimism and hope come into the picture?
I live off of optimism and hope. Those two things are not, optimism, hope, rage are not mutually exclusive. They're not. First of all, there's no way in the world that I can be a black woman in America who gets up every day to fight the fight that I'm fighting and not live on hope. There is nothing in this country that says that I'm going to win. There is nothing in what I read in the paper. There's nothing written in this Constitution. There's nothing anywhere that says that I'm going to win. And yet, I get up every day and I do this work. That's all hope. That's all I have and love.
Yeah.
I love my work. I love my folks. I love all of y'all, even though y'all get on my nerves. Not y'all. Y'all are probably good people. But I'm just saying, that's hope and love. And what happens is people water down words like hope and love and throw them out the window and toss them around like they don't mean anything. Grace and hope and love. And we treat those words like they're nothing. Those are the words that are the most powerful words, right? Those are the words. It's really easy to be nasty.
Yeah.
It's really easy to be mean. I could be angry every day. Really. Every day. There's a lot to be. You remember that list I just made? Black woman in America. Every day this country gives me a reason to be angry. But I'm not.
Yeah.
I wake up and I say I love. I give. I hope. I'm optimistic. And I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll be that.
So much of your work, too, calls people in, to join, to learn, to be informed and educated. And we have a cultural intelligence unit as part of TBWA called Backslash. And
That sounds lovely.
and we use it because it helps to understand some of the cultural shifts that are defining, the world today. And one of the cultural shifts that we've identified is counter-cancel. So the counter-cancel movement. And I think in an exceptionally polarized world where people are very divided, there is a growing number of people that are looking to, get rid of sort of toxic intolerance and instead call people in to have a commitment toward progress and, to having nuanced and informed conversations that are open and respectful. What are your thoughts around that?
Counter-cancel.
Yes.
That's interesting. I think that there's such a low tolerance for open conversation. We cannot have nuanced conversations in public. This is another conversation I was having publicly the other day. As a public figure, you are encouraged to know everything. I became first of all, I have spent my life doing all kinds of justice work. So I do know about more things than sexual violence. I did mostly racial justice work, right, for a good part of my life. And so I can comment about a lot of things, but I try to stay in my lane. I don't know about everything.
Right.
The number of things that people ask me to comment on or come forward on or make speeches about or come on CNN and talk about you would not believe. And when I say I don't know about that, the pushback that it's fine. I'm like, well, that's not fine. You should actually get an expert. But people actually don't want that. They just want a famous or a shiny thing or the person of the moment. And so I think that's great that y'all are having open conversations. I think I want space to learn.
Yeah.
I want places where I can know more and grow more. We need to create more spaces for people to learn from other people, to understand other cultures, other ideas. I want to be able to make mistakes in public and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that, and now I understand. Thank you for helping me to understand that better so I can do better next time.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, what you're saying is in line with that movement, is how do you help to inform people? How do you help to educate them? How do you provide room for people to be able to make mistakes, but then to demonstrate authentic, like being sorry, about
Yeah.
those things, being able to move forward and use that as a platform to move forward, in more positive and better ways.
But also, let me just say this. For people who are genuinely, like, there are people who are willful, and then there are people who want to be open to learn, right?
Or did you say willful?
There's some people who just, my grandma used to say, call them willful. Like, you want people who are open and honest, not folks who just willfully ignorant.
Yes.
I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So I want to talk about the level of impact that the hashtag MeToo movement has had because of the initial work that you've done. And I think few movements scale so quickly while also maintaining long-term impact. What do you attribute to the success of MeToo, and what challenges are there in managing such a legendary platform over the long term?
Well, I think that Me Too got so big so quickly because of the people who were attached to it, quite frankly. I think that we had never seen a moment in history where you had these huge named people, like the celebrities who initially came forward. I think there had been scandals, quote unquote, before, and where there was like a tug of war of who's telling the truth, blah, 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 and that kind of thing. But when Me Too went viral surrounding the Weinstein case, you had numbers of women coming forward. It was very different. It was set up very different. And then the case was first, obviously. And then having the hashtag go viral, it was not the actresses, it was the everyday people who finally felt comfortable to say, well, I'm gonna tell the truth.
Right.
And then the scores of people, you just couldn't look away. You just could not look away. And I think one of the things that never gets really made clear is that Me Too really wasn't built, hashtag going viral wasn't really built. The actresses, I think, made the space, but it was the people who made the movement, right? It was the everyday people who just finally were like, listen, we have the space now to say this. And once it happened, you couldn't not know, right? You couldn't close your eyes. You couldn't say you didn't see it. You just couldn't. And I think people finally had language and a shorthand even to, even though making it into a verb is not okay, people have to stop saying people got me too. That's just not okay. But the shorthand language that it gave people to start conversations, I think, the other side of the story that we don't talk about, that you don't hear talk about enough, are the private conversations that happen in homes and things like that. people that I talk to, and I've talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of people at this point, that tell me about the conversations, not just mostly not in the workplace, but it was like conversations about harassment, yes, that led to people talking about child sexual abuse, about lots and lots of stories of things that happen on college campuses. And, it just unearthed a thing that unlike we've ever seen. And I think similar to the reckoning that people saw around, with Black Lives Matter, it was different because we had video of these horrific things that you couldn't ignore. But, once the video went viral, people found a way to ignore it. It's like they took them little black boxes out there, profile pictures. People could ignore it until the next thing came. The stories kept coming. Yeah. And then you had the cases attached to it. So there was that. And then a year later, the Kavanaugh hearing happened. And that was, besides the hearing happening, around the Kavanaugh hearing was the first time we had a really major feet to the street protesting in the country around sexual violence, where people were organizing in the street. So I think we saw some really unprecedented things happening around sexual violence in this country. A lot of times sexual violence gets couched in other issues. So there's here are the women's issues, and there's a list, and sexual violence might be thrown in there. But we got sort of pulled out for the first time and seen as our own issue. And that, I went from a person who was literally begging to be on agendas to a person who was being asked to come to the White House, right? Or, around the White House, because, Trump is still in office. But, it was really fascinating to see that happen in such a short period of time. And since then, I think there's also, even though the backlash has been tremendous and swift.
I can imagine, yeah.
I mean, whew. And it's funny, I was so naive. That first year, people kept saying the backlash is coming and it's going to be big. And I was like, what could the opposite argument to consent be?
And that's the thing is people often like to say that there's another side to it. And there's no other side to human rights issues.
I promise you, I remember having this conversation with this very powerful woman, senator, I could say her name, I think it was Dianne Feinstein or somebody like that, who was like, you have to prepare yourself. And I was like, we're talking about rape. What's the opposite argument to don't rape people? And she was like, you'd be surprised. And I was like, psh.
We've seen those arguments over the last several years.
Oh, yes. My gosh. And so to the other part of this, to what's been hard, that's been hard.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not a cry. I'm a big crier now, actually. Big crier. It's really hard. But I'm not like an emotional person in that way, or else I wasn't. I remember the first time that this woman arguing with me about how she was a survivor, arguing with me and talking about how, just get over it. It's just ridiculous. I was raped. It's not that big a deal. You're ruining our country. What about my son? And I was just like, yo, are you, this is not real. This is not real.
Yeah.
It just took me, I was not prepared. And I think because I lived in a bubble of people who thought like me.
Yes,
and who
supported the work.
Right. And being thrust into the world of people who just would put politics, and let me just say this, politics on both sides. I don't even mean this in a bipartisan way. I mean people who put politics, period, capital D, capital R, put politics before this issue was astonishing. And it hurt so badly just because I didn't understand it. I still don't understand it. Yeah. We're talking about humanity, right, at the end of the day. But I was naive.
So I actually want to go back to a couple of things that you said at the beginning of the response, because I think it's super important in thinking about how you maintain, the long-term success of a movement or of a platform. And I think one of the things you talked about was breaking the echo chamber and making sure that, whether you're a brand or an individual or a leader, that you are cultivating platforms and forums for discussion so that, to give people access to diverse perspectives and to ensure that there's an opportunity, to foster respectful dialogue around some of these things.
Yes, I would tell you the biggest part of our success, bar none, is people. Is the relationships and the messaging that we have been able to break through to people. It has been the fact that I mean I have traveled so much across this country, and I've tried to at least be consistent and clear everywhere I've gone about what this movement is, who we serve, and what our goals are for 5 years. No matter what you see on television, no matter what court cases you see, no matter who you hear, this is what the movement is. We are a movement about healing and action. This is who we serve. We serve with the most marginalized people, and that is not to the exclusion of anybody else. I have said that thousands of times and been consistent, and it works. And I think people understand what the movement is. And that is us against the mainstream, right? Against mainstream media. But it is because I've had relationships and built relationships with advertising agencies, with other corporations, and I've had to do that up against social media trolls and mainstream media that really makes money. Whenever there's a big court case, it's like, is this the death of the Me Too movement? Is this the end of the Me Too movement? Will Me Too survive this? And then I have to go on a tour again and say, y'all, that's not Me Too. Me Too is serving you, and it's people who I say, and I started saying this in the beginning. I say, y'all, in 5 years, you're not going to see me at the Golden Globes and the Oscars and on the red carpets, and that doesn't matter. None of this matters. You see after like year 2, year 3, you stop seeing me going on MSNBC, and I stopped doing all of that stuff because I realized people were conflating my appearances with my connection to all of the big court cases and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's not my work. My work is for you. My organization deals with this, and that. It's people is why we have continued success and why we'll have longevity.
Yeah, that's great. So I have one more question for you, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to the audience because we're going to do a Q&A the last 15 minutes of the session. And I meant to say this at the beginning, but if you have the South by Southwest app, please make sure you use the engage button, and you can submit questions that way. But I wanted to shift and talk about the responsibility of brands to take a stance on issues of equity.
Ooh, let's get into it.
Yes, and one of I mentioned earlier that we've got this cultural intelligence unit, and it talks about the cultural shifts. And one of the shifts that we're focused on is called activist awakening. And I mean, you mentioned yourself, whether it's from climate change to issues of inequity. People are, standing up and being vocal about these things. I mean, we saw, Dutch players in the World Cup who wore black jerseys in support of migrant workers to mourn, the workers who died as they were building the stadiums. And we're dealing with human rights abuses and wage, issues and discrimination. We saw Welsh World Cup players who, at training camp, they raised rainbow flags in support of LGBTQ practices and policies. We've seen, I was going to say, we've seen, across the globe, there's been growing support for the Iranians' fight against, oppressive gendered laws. So inaction is no longer an option. And, individuals are calling out the government and corporations and demanding, rightfully so, immediate and large-scale action. I think a telling statistic is that 61% of people trust businesses more than they trust the government, media, and even NGOs. Wow. And so I think that gives brands not only an advantage, but the responsibility to contribute to positive societal change. But as we talked about, like Me Too did provoke discomfort and fear among people because they're worried about, saying the wrong thing. And we talk a lot about in our company about perfection paralysis, which is, people feeling overwhelmed and scared about doing the wrong thing and being called to task publicly. So how would you advise individuals and companies to move forward when change, number one, can feel really overwhelming, and number two, when you're not sure what the right next steps are?
Let me say this. I think that, first of all, I've worked in nonprofits my whole life. So corporate America, corporate culture is weird to me a little bit, a little bit. But I've gotten to know so many people, particularly in the last 5 years, who work in the corporate sector, and y'all are, it's just people. it's just people. And so as I talk to folk, I understand the issues a little bit more. And I've had a lot of talks in corporate, in a lot of different corporate companies. One, I think that DEI, corporations have to understand that DEI is not a initiative.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, it's not an initiative, right? It has to be, and I say this at colleges too, it has to be weaved throughout every facet of the company, or it's not real. It's not real. One of the things I say about sexual violence, or sexual misconduct, if you will, at companies is, what is it about this person that made him feel comfortable to do this it's not okay to just fire the person. You got to weave out the culture.
That's right. Create the environment, yes.
What environment did he feel? So Jack got hired, Jack came here, and Jack exposed himself to Jill. What did Jack see around the office that made him think that was okay? You got to talk to somebody in HR.
What was the example that was set by the leaders at the highest levels
Jack
of the company?
saw Johnny doing something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. DEI has to be a priority from the person who is filing, dumping out the garbage, all the way up to the C-suite. And what I see is they treat DEI like an initiative, a box that they check off. We covered everything, and they looking around. I know
it operates in a silo.
It operates in a complete silo, and that means that your budget should reflect it, your program should reflect it. So that's one thing. Take it seriously, right? The second part about the paralysis is this is a big thing. It's about courage. It's okay, and I know some of this is not just inside the company, it's from outside, pressure from outside. But these companies have to have a little courage. It's okay to make a mistake. And when you make a mistake, what you need to do is say, we made a mistake. We wanted to try this thing. We tried it. It didn't work. And so what we're going to do is regroup, look at the mistakes we made, and try something different.
Well, and also owning your mistakes builds trust.
Exactly.
It builds trust, and people relate to that.
Everybody makes mistakes, so people relate to that. What we don't relate to is being like, no, it worked.
Yes.
It just didn't work the way you thought it was going to work, but it worked. No, it didn't. We work here. We see it didn't work.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, you have more credibility as, a leader, as a brand, when you're able to stand in front of your mistakes and you're not scared. You have the courage to own up to those things and build a platform on top of that to say, this is how we're moving forward courageously.
And different courage. We have so much trouble getting corporations to work with us because they're like, well, we don't want to be political. This is not a political issue. This is a human issue.
Yes.
This is a human issue. This is an issue that affects all the people who work at your job. So getting into a relationship with the Me Too movement is not a political decision. It's a human decision. That takes courage.
Yep. That's one of the challenges too, is how to reframe that so people understand that this is not like a political issue. And when you talk about sexual violence and sexual assault, it also isn't just a personal issue between two people, and it's not a cultural issue, right? It's a human rights issue that that as a society we have to address.
This is exactly what we're talking about. This is a social justice issue. Just like if you are talking about racial injustice, sexual violence is inextricably linked to all the major social justice issues that we're dealing with today. You cannot have a conversation about police brutality, mass incarceration, you know, almost anything, racial injustice, without talking about sexual violence.
Yeah.
So we need corporations to have more courage. And I also think, just in a general, I did, in the book I did with Brene Brown, I talked about, I can't remember the name of my own book, y'all. Oh, You Are Your Best Thing. Sorry. I need to eat more almonds. I'm terrible. But I talked about this, you know, right now we always have these fads, what I call them fads, these moments where people are so excited about something, right? And in the moment, I feel like we're just excited about racial justice, or now what do they call anti-racism? I'm so anti-racist. And so everybody's reading the anti-racism books, and they're rushing to do the anti-racism, and they follow all the little anti-racism people on Instagram. Y'all better, remember I was telling you about credibility and community? See what those people was doing a year before 2020. Because some of them was just doing yoga and, you know, mommy and me classes, and now they anti-racist educators. But I digress. Anyway, everybody's an expert now because they black. Just because they black don't make them anti. Anyway, let me stop.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the questions.
I'm gonna get to the questions.
But real quick, I think that what you said about the responsibility of brands in this space and business leaders is so crucial, because
I got one more.
Okay.
I got one more. What I'm saying about the responsibility of brands is that if you're going to be anti-racist for real, the step before that is to be human. What I said in that book is, I don't believe you're anti-racist anything if you are not checked into my humanity. So what these companies have to do is check into the humanity of the people who you are employing. Because what they do is they'll bring in the anti-racist speaker or do the blah, blah, blah. But do you understand the material lives of the people who work for you? They do the same thing for LGBTQ or trans rights or the disability or whatever it is, right? They check a box for whatever that is, but do you understand the material lives of the people who are working for you? And that means that you have to understand our humanity first, who we are as people. And that is really, I know these corporations don't, I'm not gonna say they don't care, but you know they don't really care. But even if it's about your bottom line, if you really want people to love the places they work and enjoy the spaces they occupy, then invest in our humanity, invest in who we are as people. Don't just throw speakers at us. Don't just put up, you know, Taco Tuesdays and red, black, and green things. Like, invest in who we are and don't lump us all together, right? Don't just forget about who we are as human beings. And those are the three things I think the takeaways for folks. As far as what I just said, I forgot. Y'all got it? The DEI is not just an initiative.
Yes.
Have some corporate courage and invest in folks' humanity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's so beautifully put. And I think based on the work that you've done, that a number of other activists have done around, you know, all of the issues that we're facing today, I'm optimistic about the new crop of leaders who put humanity at the forefront of, you know, business decisions, and they put their people first. I'm just going to say really quickly before we get to the questions that, because I got to repeat it as a DEI practitioner, that ensuring that you're integrating the work across the entire business enterprise is critically important. And you do that by having an accountability framework where you have governance, where you understand who's responsible for what. You're formalizing the work. You have you know, goals that you're setting, key metrics that you're reporting out and sharing with your employees. I think the accountability piece is incredibly important. And the investment, you talked about the investment in that work and looking at it from a holistic approach versus like a lightning rod thing to do. You know, this impacts not only your employees, but your consumers, your suppliers, you know, your clients, et cetera. All right, so let's get to the questions. Let's go to the first one up here. It says, Twitter was a huge part of the hashtag MeToo scale. How is MeToo harnessing social media today and in the future?
Well, that's a great question, because I will say, I'm going to expand it a little bit and say social media and technology. we just had a huge, I'll just say, meeting internally. Our organization, MeToo, our website is MeTooMVMT.org. And one of the things that was really important to me, because Me Too, when Me Too went viral, I felt like we had an obligation to respond to the people who actually said Me Too. But in reality, we are a very small organization, right? We spent a lot of time getting conflated with other organizations that existed that were much bigger than us. But our organization is very small. And so the way that we were able to do that is through technology, both social media and through our website and other digital platforms. So we're doing that. We've created some really beautiful resources. One of the things that was really difficult when I first started this work was to find resources for folks that were really culturally relevant and culturally specific. So our website and our platforms that we've created have, one is our healing resources. We have healing resources that you can filter by so many different specificities, by age and race and gender and a number of different things all across the country, and we're constantly updating those. We also have something called Survivor Sanctuary, which is its own independent platform. And so, the 800 numbers that exist, the national 800 number, a lot of people don't want to call an 800 number or won't. Or when you do, it's like sort of a one-shot thing, and you actually don't know where you'll be placed when you call the 800 number. So Survivor Sanctuary is an alternative, or in addition to that. It's a website that walks you through a series of videos. You can come back to it and come back and forth to it. It's just a really beautiful space that you can go to. So we have Survivor Sanctuary, we have our Healing and Resource Library, and then we have a platform called Act Two. And Act Two is for people who are not survivors necessarily, but want to take action. Because 9 times out of 10, when I would travel around and go, speak out in places like this, afterwards people would say, I want to be a part of the movement, or how can I take action? And I realized that there's no way that I could just tell people. I would be in different places. So we curated these resources from around the country, and soon it'll be around the world. We're curating from other global places, of what's happening in different states. So Act Two allows you to put in your state and filter by where you are to see what's happening in your state. Now, the truth is, there's not a lot happening everywhere, but so we also are asking people to give us information for what's happening in their state, so we can build the Act Two platform. So yeah, we're trying.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that the way that we can use social media and technology in the future is to provide access on a much larger scale to people for resources that they may not otherwise have.
Absolutely, that is the only way we can really build. The healing part of our action and healing, well, really action and healing, is going to be technology. Technology is going to be, it is currently and will continue to be the way we grow this movement. We can't, it's just, every 68 seconds in this country is another act of sexual violence, right? It really is a public health crisis. And the way that we can best, use our resources is through technology. And so we'll continue to do that.
All right, well, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to read...
The first one?
I'm sorry?
The top
Oh,
one.
yes, that's a great question. How can men be a greater part of the solution to this epidemic sexual violence and trauma?
Well, I love this question because, one, every time we talk about men, they're always only framed as a part of the solution or the perpetrator. So one, I always like to say that the first role of men in the Me Too movement is as survivors. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made, or one of the ways that we need to course correct, is that the movement has been framed solely as a woman's movement.
Yes.
Right? And I understand why, right? At the time that Me Too went viral is on the heels of the Women's March, and it was all women that came forward, and it's largely women who are survivors. But it's more than more than people who identify as women that are survivors, and masses of men who are survivors. So one, I want to say that it's not just a women's movement, and men's first role in this movement is as survivors. And I think one of the things that can help the movement, that men can do to help the movement grow, is to be open to identifying as survivors, those who are comfortable, obviously. open to identifying the survivors. And from our end, those of us who are in leadership in the movement have to do a much better job of framing it as not just a women's movement, for more than just men, for people who identify across the gender spectrum.
Yeah. And I think we saw some of that too,
Yeah.
I think that's the effects of, the Me Too movement too, is hearing more from men who are survivors of sexual abuse. And so I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of like framing, the movement that way. But we're starting to see more and more of that.
For sure. And we're trying to do a better job of that. And in terms of, I think the other part is that men who attend things like this, who hear, us, hear me or other people who are in leadership in the movement speak, it's really important that you share these conversations. It's really important that you help us reframe the conversation around Me Too. It's not a gender war. It's not about cancel culture. It really is a social justice movement that is about helping to end sexual violence, right? This is a public health crisis. This is something that happens every 68 seconds in this country, and it affects the material lives of the people who we love, who are around us. This is something that we want to end like we want to end gun violence. Like the thing that really strikes me, I use this analogy all the time. Like when somebody is shot in our community, we rally. Right? You see people who get together and they say, we have to get guns off the street. We have to make sure that we want our children to get home safely. We want to make sure that we can, sleep at night in our communities. We have to get these guns. We see these mass shootings and people rally around those things. And when a person experiences sexual violence in our community, there is silence. There may be a march on a college campus, but people say things like, what was she wearing? Or people say things like, he was a good man. He would never do that. Right? We need the same kind of outrage. We need the same kind of response when there's an act of sexual violence in our community. We need people to say, this community has to be safe. We want our communities to be safe. Sexual violence is a social justice issue. It's a human rights issue, and we need to embrace it like that. Forget about these things that you see on television. Forget about these big cases that you see. Those are individual cases that are not really affecting our material lives, the material lives of survivors. Yeah. So it's important that not just men, that all of you who hear the reality of what this movement is, go back and share those stories so we can help in reframing what it is.
Yeah, incredible words. We're out of time. I'm going to take 10 seconds to leave you with a couple of key takeaways, because I think there have been some really important nuggets of information that you've shared today. The one is I just wanted to talk about like the keys to an effective platform and some of the things that you mentioned. One was about embracing empathy and building a platform in shared experience and emotional connection. The second was in authentic storytelling, making sure that people who are members of those communities have the ability to lead those stories. And then third is around community building, because an effective platform can't exist without a community-centric approach. And then a couple of things that we talked about in terms of advice and action items for whether you're a business leader or a company, and how to move towards equity. And the first is as a business or a brand, we're not a movement, so you have the ability and the freedom to move differently in the space and be proactive and make sure that you're not just taking a stance vocally, but that you're supplying resources, in order to take action. The second is to make sure that we're taking a holistic view on this and not, working for DEI as an initiative that's in a vacuum, but it's something that's integrated across the entire business enterprise through a system of accountability. And then, looking at this as building framework and structure around the work and being able to measure, report, and communicate that, vocally with your employee base. Tarana, thank you so much for the discussion today. And thank you so much to all of you for joining. I hope that you were able to take some valuable insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.